Enter the world of the paranormal.
UFOs.
Alien abductions.
Ghosts.
Out-of-body experiences.
Past lives.
Distant viewing.
Government cover-ups.
Welcome to Sightings on the Radio. No mystery is closed to an open mind. Sightings on the Radio. With your host, Jeff Rense.
And hello once again, everybody. Of all the current writers researching the field of UFOs, ETs, secret weapons technology, and other enigmatic and occult areas, perhaps none is more controversial or respected than Jim Keith, who has, to date, authored over 10 of the most intriguing books now on the market. Jim's latest book represents another intriguing look at an unknown and highly controversial phenomenon. Its title is Casebook on the Men in Black, and it is published by Illuminate Press. Men in Black incidents straddle the realms of mysticism and science, occultism and UFOs, material reality and fantasy, partaking of all, defined by none. Since ancient times, these mysterious beings have stalked the planet, and in recent years they have tried to silence witnesses of UFO sightings with threats, harassment, and even worse. Who are these strange beings garbed all in black? Are they government agents, aliens, creatures from another dimension? Well, in Casebook on the Men in Black, author Jim Keith traces the path of these unusual visitors through history and presents startling evidence about their origin and their purpose. So let's say hello now to my guest tonight, Jim Keith. Hello, Jim. Are you there?
Hi there, Jeff. Yes, I am.
I want to thank you for coming on the program. I've been trying to get you on this show for a long time, and it's overdue, so we're going to have fun tonight. Casebook on the Men in Black. How much research went into it? I imagine quite a bit, since you're talking about a phenomenon that apparently goes back a long time.
Well, I don't want to sound like a hoary old graybeard or anything, but I've been interested in the paranormal and in conspiracy since I was a kid, and I've been hearing about the Men in Black really since the 1950s, and so I guess you could say that I've been researching them all along. On the other hand, I did bust the books and get on the internet and contact everybody I knew over a period of 6 months to find out everything that I could just recently to write the book.
Tell me what, as a kid in the 50s, you heard about the Men in Black. I didn't hear about them.
Well, I was a big UFO a big UFO buff, I should say.
Sure.
Back then, I bought hook, line, and sinker the writings of guys like George Adamski and Truman Bertram, who believed that or said that they had taken trips to other planets in UFOs.
Right.
And the Men in Black, were mentioned sporadically back then in connection with early UFO incidents, like, for instance, the Maury Island contact, the Albert Bender contact with Men in Black, and so I sort of heard about them out of my peripheral ear, mm-hmm. And I recall as a kid always, just kind of keeping my eyes open for neighbors who I thought might be aliens.
Well, there's a good imagination for you. All you had to do is go to the theater and see something like Invaders from Mars or It Came from Outer Space, and any kid with an imagination is off to the races.
Yeah, not just kids either. There's something to be said for those early UFO, or those early science fiction movies, in a way shaping the content of people's abduction scenarios and what they experienced. For instance, those big-headed aliens are really not much in evidence prior to the 1950s when they appeared in the movies. Not to say that UFO contact isn't real, but I think that it has a paranormal aspect that is also shaped by our minds.
I agree. Speaking of that film, and I guess it's available in video stores, Invaders from Mars, the little kid looking through the telescope, watching people fall through the sand and into the underground chambers. That movie has always raised issues in my mind. Did the people somehow writing that film have information or contacts which fed them information? Because we're talking about a film, 1953, that has abductions, implants, a drone race serving a highly evolved being, which has a rather large head and not much of a torso, and I believe just a few long tentacles or something. It was a very interesting film, and I found it to be rather suspiciously well informed in retrospect.
Yeah, remarkably so, because usually contactees back in those days were more often visited by these sort of tall, Aryan, blonde-haired characters rather than big-headed aliens. It was a kind of a full-blown prediction of the experiences people would start to have, really starting about the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then the other one I really liked was, I think it was Richard Denning. It Came from Outer Space. Remember that one?
Indeed, I do. One of my other failings is having been a monster and science fiction fan as a child.
Well, that's wonderful. I'd rather do that than sit down and watch MTV for 40 hours a week.
I guess so.
So It Came from Outer Space. The craft that looked like a meteorite. It really wasn't. It was a ship. It landed in the desert. It was in trouble. And the beings on board wanted simply time to repair it and get the heck out of here. It reminds me of the October 13th meteorite overflight over Los Angeles, which has been termed by a number of people as actually a spacecraft that landed in Northridge in the hills there at Rocketdyne, was repaired and took off. We're going to do a program about that again quite soon. But again, a very prescient kind of plot.
Yeah, and it's not completely out of the question that the movie makers at that time might have been contacted by people who had a vested interest in this, because in FBI memos, CIA memos back at that time, they pretty well assumed that they could influence the media. One example of that taking place somewhat later is President Nixon deciding that the movies and the TV should portray all of these crime-fighting motifs, at which point all of them started to do that with the Untouchables and so forth.
Exactly, and you really confirmed a suspicion I had. I don't want to lean too far in that direction, but it does seem pretty obvious that the possibility, it was certainly a very viable one, that some people in the film industry at that time were getting some information, because the plots were really advanced if you think about what we know now.
Sure, it could easily have been.
Men in Black. You talk in the book about how they've been really around for thousands of years. They certainly weren't wearing two-piece suits, 500 years ago. But when you talk about Men in Black, what's the old-style interpretation of how they appeared?
Well, in olden times, they were thought to be agents of the devil. And they would be seen at witches' sabbats, and they would be contacting people and having them sell their soul. And people would ride to these witches' conclaves on pigs, and there would be a man in black officiating at some kind of a sacrificial ceremony or so forth. But really, starting about the 1900s, more often you see the Men in Black seen in a technological context, usually seen in conjunction with a witness who has seen a UFO. And the Men in Black will show up at their doorstep, often in groups of 3, and warn them not to say a thing about it.
Kind of like Jehovah's Witnesses.
Indeed.
No kidding. Just door to door, and we have historical precedent going back to the beginning of this century that was going on.
Right. Well, actually, the door-to-door kind of thing, warning against the supernatural or the occult or the UFO thing, didn't take place back in the Middle Ages. Like I said, it was mostly, they were thought to be agents of the devil.
I see.
But in the 20th century, apparently the devil is not quite so believable of a figure, and so these Men in Black are usually trying to hush people up about their occurrences with UFOs.
Oh, interesting. Have you run across very many people in your research who claim to have had direct encounters with these men?
I've run across a number. I've collected literally hundreds of examples of this, and I must say it is truly a strange phenomenon. When I first went into studying the issue of the Men in Black, I was extraordinarily skeptical about it, and particularly about the paranormal element. But after digging into a lot of these cases, I found I just couldn't ignore them. There were too many credible witnesses. There were too many people who didn't apparently have an axe to grind about it. And I've come to believe that there is a kind of a paranormal Men in Black, as well as other solutions for the Men in Black as well. I don't think that you can categorize every Man in Black visitation as being paranormal or as being government or as being hoax. I think it's a mixture of those things.
Or it could be a guy just who happens to like black suits.
Well, indeed, that might be that might be considered the delusion aspect or the fish story aspect of Men in Black. A lot of the ufological subculture, people who are really into this, they do tend to weave quite a web and believe that everything that happens to them has something to do with UFOs. Like I said, when I was a kid, I was always seeing sinister aliens out of the corner of my eye.
I wonder if there really were any there.
That's a good question. You know, a bit later, I did have an encounter with a gray, and I'm really more well known for talking about the government connections with UFOs, but I don't discount the alien / paranormal aspect either.
All right, it's quite a field, isn't it? It's wide open. We're going to take a break here, Jim, and come right back. Jim Keith, the guest tonight, his new book entitled Casebook on the Men in Black.
You're listening to Sightings on the Radio.
And welcome back. My guest tonight, Jim Keith, his new book, Casebook on the Men in Black. It's $14.95, 224 pages. It's a big 5.5 by 8.5 quality paperback, available from Illuminate Press, which is most easily reached either by catalog in your mailbox, or you can check it out on the internet, www.illuminate. That's ILLUMINET, illuminate.com, and it'll get you right there. Just check out Jim Keith's new book, Casebook on the Men in Black. How do these men dress, Jim? I mean, what are they wearing? They're not dressed like Orson Welles in his later years, are they?
No, they usually tend to be rather slim, and naturally they dress in black. And also, strangely enough, they seem to be somewhat of car buffs with old Cadillacs, old black Cadillacs as the vehicle that they seem to like. Oddly enough, many of these men in black are Oriental or Oriental appearing, with slanted eyes, sometimes dark or ruddy skin. Another detail that we often have heard about is that their fingers are very long. And some of these guys walk in a stiff or mechanical fashion and sound like machines when they talk. I know this sounds like something out of the science fiction movies from the 50s that we were talking about.
Sure.
And that is truly one of the odd things, is that these guys are really the weirdest characters that anyone has ever encountered.
Now, these descriptions that you're reporting come from a variety of sources over, I guess, a fairly wide area of geography.
It's mostly in the United States, but on the other hand, most of our media in the United States is centered here, so that perhaps we're not hearing all about the Men in Black encounters in Eastern Asia or whatever. I do have accounts in England, in Australia, a few of them coming out of China, but primarily it's in the United States.
Are they wearing black there as well?
Right.
No kidding.
Yeah.
You tell me they're driving 1967 Cadillacs in Peking?
That's right. No. No, all of the details do not necessarily apply to each Men in Black instance, but those are a very familiar recurring motifs.
Uh-huh.
In China, I recall one incident where a young man encountered one of these Men in Black out in a rice patch. I guess they bear the environment that they are in.
Uh-huh. Oh, interesting. So, black suits, white shirt, black tie, black hat, dark glasses?
Well, not always. You know, there was an instance that I'm quite fond of where a very large man in black named Tiny showed up at the house of some folks in the 1950s, the Christensen family, and he had on a black Russian fur hat, very pasty face. He talked very strange, and he had a wire coming up from underneath his sock and going into his leg where there was a brown spot. He questioned the people. They had had a UFO incident. They'd seen a UFO, but he didn't ask them about that. He said he was with the Missing Heirs Bureau and that they might be inheriting some money. And he questioned them about that, asking all kinds of details about their family. At a certain point, he said that he would need a glass of water in about 15 minutes, and as he talked, his face turned redder and redder. In 15 minutes, he asked for that glass of water, took a pill, and then his face went back to its normal, a pale complexion.
That sounds perfectly normal to me.
Yeah.
Maybe the hat wasn't a hat.
Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was concealing an underground base. I don't know, Jeff.
I always like Jim Keith because he has a sense of humor. He never takes himself too seriously. These guys described as having oriental eyes. We're getting to the almond eye syndrome again, and the long fingers, of course, will trigger a lot of identity with people here with aliens. Are these fellas all fellas, or do we have fellas and gals in black?
Just off the top of my head, I don't recall any women in black that strictly meet that standard.
There was a woman in red once, I heard.
That's right. A Gene Wilder film, I think. But actually, I do recall a couple of instances where the men in black were accompanied by strange women who necessarily didn't share their gothic taste in clothes.
So the strange guys are out on the town, hey?
Could be.
Fraternizing with the Earthlings. Do we think that these fellas might be off-planet, or do we have any reason to think that they may be abnormal in their genetic history, beside the appearance aspect of it?
I'm trying to think of some genetic characteristics, but primarily what I said. As far as being off-planet, I don't know that there are any indications of that, just as I'm not sure that there are any indications that UFOs are off-planet. People have speculated that they might be ultra-terrestrial. They might go between dimensions. Because, in fact, we have nothing that really proves to us that either the Men in Black or UFOs have an extraterrestrial source. They might just as well come from South America, for all we know.
Right.
People assume they're from outer space, but I think that connection was primarily bolstered by the early days of UFO talk, where we had these wild tales of flying in UFOs to other planets. I personally think that a lot of those accounts are in question.
Well, I would think so, yes. That's sort of common sense. There have been a lot of folks step forward and say they just got back from Mars or Jupiter or Venus and so forth, and you got to say, hey, wait a minute. Tell me about George Adamski. He's a name that is a little enigmatic to many people who are beginning to research the UFO field. He came up with some remarkable pictures, which again now are being, I think, rather looked upon as they just might possibly be real.
I guess it's in question, but Adamski was kind of a curious question. He was pretty well considered as Mr. UFO back in the 1950s. And he also associated with a few other famous UFO guys back then. For instance, George Hunt Williamson, who claimed that he had seen Adamski making a contact. But there's a lot of elements about Adamski that don't usually come out. Number one, that his early researches were funded by a British intelligence agency. Also, that he was contacted by intelligence agencies early on by his admission in order to gain these photographs. Adamski also traveled around the world using a passport with special privileges. So there may have been more to Adamski than meets the eye. I personally, although as a child, like I said, I bought Adamski hook, line, and sinker. I find his stories extremely unbelievable now, and in fact, according to people who were there at the time, his UFO contact had earlier been written as science fiction, in which field those stories didn't sell, and then he revised them for the UFO market.
Oh, interesting. This is good to hear. Good angles I haven't run across too often. So George Adamski would have us believe in his heyday that he had friends in very high places, but maybe not so much higher than government agents.
There are indications of that, and I think that one of the sources for the Men in Black encounters are government. But I think people make the mistake of assuming that all UFO encounters and all Men in Black encounters are of one nature. People kind of get on a hobby horse and ride it and assume that it's extraterrestrials or that it's completely government. But I find that those areas cross connect, and that we see UFO encounters taking place, and then we also see government UFO incidents taking place as well.
Do the reports of Men in Black almost invariably relate to threats, harassment, or are there other aspects of their interaction with people that may have a different side to it? We'll ask you to hold that answer and give it to us as we continue here, Jim Keith, in just a couple of minutes at Sightings on the Radio. I'm Jeff Rense, and you're listening to this program on the premier radio networks.
You're listening to Sightings on the Radio.
Okay, we are back talking with Jim Keith tonight, one of my favorite authors. There are a number of intriguing chapters in the book, Jim, which I honestly have to be upfront and tell you I haven't gotten a copy of it yet, so I'm looking forward to that. The movie is out now. We might talk about that in a minute. There are chapters in the book. One is called Hoaxed Men in Black. Tell us about that a bit.
Right. Well, like I said, there are a number of different explanations for the Men in Black, and if you assume there's just one, you'll go off the rails on this. One of the things that makes it difficult to understand the Men in Black are the activities of hoaxers, and many of these guys have been among the more well-known researchers, so-called, in the UFO research community.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it may be that some of these hoaxers are associated with government, while others may be just having, good malicious fun at the expense of the UFO buff. I bring out the names of a few prominent UFO people who have hoaxed and have admitted to doing Men in Black hoaxes.
Give me, since you've got it in the book, Jim, give me a couple names.
Yeah, there's a prominent UFO researcher named Jim Moseley, who goes back to the time of the birth of God on UFOs. I mean, he interviewed all of these early UFO contactees back in the 50s, and he's still around. He puts out a newsletter called Saucer Smear.
Oh, he's a crusty old fellow.
Oh, he's actually quite a fun guy, and he admits to having done hoaxing. Also, somebody that it's easier to talk about because he's dead is a very famous UFO researcher named Gray Barker. Who was very popular in the 1950s. And according to John Keel, another famous researcher, at a certain point, Gray just started hoaxing flat out and was responsible for a number of these encounters, as well as incidents that kind of, in a way, shaped the UFO field. Faked photography. Gray Barker is allegedly responsible for the Hangar 18 thing. Gray was very active in blowing people's minds.
Wow. We talk on this program a lot about disinformation organized and funded ultimately by you and I, but in a way, this field of UFO, paranormal, ET research is so heavily populated with people on such really substantial ego trips, jealousies, pettiness, and so forth. I don't know how much disinformation the powers that be would even have to crank out here.
Well, I take your point, but apparently they are interested in that. You do see a lot of the UFO researchers with government connections insisting strictly on the extraterrestrial connection and never, ever entertaining the idea that the government might have anything to do with this.
Correct.
We do see, for instance, in a situation like Area 51, where a lot of advanced craft and strange craft were being flown, we see disinformation being pumped out by the reams to confuse that issue. And in fact, a lot of the worldview of many UFO buffs today has been significantly shaped by these kind of disinformation programs that centered among people like Richard Doty out of the Air Force Base in Albuquerque.
Yes.
I mean, the whole underground base implantation scenario, and the MJ-12 document, for that matter, apparently came out of that area full-blown.
You don't buy the MJ-12 document then at all?
No, I don't. Having fair familiarity with secret documents without having a government background. I mean, I've read hundreds of these things in the course of my research.
Yes.
Right from the beginning, it seemed to be a put-up job. I've never seen anything written in that kind of prose coming out of the government, and in addition to that, it seemed to synopsize the whole issue so wonderfully well in a way that UFO buffs would have loved to have seen right when it came out.
It was a little too neat, wasn't it?
It was a little too neat, and in addition to that, I guess there are other discrepancies. I'm told that the typewriter that it was done on didn't come out until '63, when in fact the document was supposed to have been penned in '52 or some such.
Interesting. The issue of disinformation continues. Would you suggest that there are a number of so-called top UFO researchers who are eminent in the field, respected, well-known, who may be de facto working for other folks?
I don't think there's any question about it. For instance, I hate being stuck with this label of being controversial, but I can't seem to help it. But William Moore, for instance, has admitted collaboration with the government. He also has had close contact with this Sergeant Richard Doty out of the Air Force Base in Albuquerque.
Well, Moore has an interesting way of trying to explain that away, though, doesn't he?
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of the me lie explanation. I don't know what it is. I don't really know what was going on. I guess maybe he assumed by being in, or he may have assumed that by being in touch with the government he could find out what they knew. I don't really know, but on the other hand, he has admitted that he was informing on other researchers, which I think goes outside the boundary of ethics.
Pretty abhorrent, yes.
I didn't hear you, Jeff.
Pretty abhorrent.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, okay, well, that's a good point. I'm concerned about all the people out there listening. How are they going to try to draw the line for themselves between fact, fiction, and the old gray basket area? It's getting harder and harder as more and more people enter this field as researchers, co-opt other people's material, and begin to stand up on a soapbox and give a slick and glib presentation. There are so many people out there waiting and just hoping for something new and unique to come along to embrace. It's pretty easy pickings, isn't it?
Well, I suppose it's the same way with anything. By and large, the public are not particularly discriminatory, not particularly analytical, and never have been. I guess we're sort of preaching to the converted. The only people who will grasp the idea of being a little bit more scrupulous on understanding this material and digging a little deeper than just believing everything that comes down the pike already know that. I guess the only weapon that one can use in this situation is Occam's razor, which is, if it seems outrageous, it probably is. And then you just better one had better learn how to think and analyze, because in fact the human creature is prone to lying and being an entrepreneur, and frankly, wild stories of gray aliens sell a lot better than stories about sneaky government guys.
It's really becoming almost a lost art, that being the discriminatory ability of the average American to look at something, to think about it, and to come up with any kind of an independent opinion. We all seem to be being pushed in one area or another to assume a certain, what they're calling, common knowledge profiles anymore. And you're right, they're not built on solid foundations. It's certainly not a science. Do you see a time when the study of UFOs will attain a measure of credibility here, or is it going to continue to be consigned to that fringe area that it has inhabited for so long?
Never, Jeff, never. As an example of an area that the public has been, in quotes, sold, we look at cattle mutilations. Now, if you get all your information from TV and UFO magazines, you will assume that it's extraterrestrials who are going around, and they have a vampiric taste for blood, and that cattle mutilations are usually seen in the context of the landing of flying saucers. when you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find out there's another whole story that is not being told, and that is that cattle mutilations more often take place with black helicopters in the area. Also, many of these mutilations have been found to have been injected with nicotine. Now, nicotine is the primary agent that is used in tranquilizer guns.
Interesting. Very interesting. Jim, we have to pause. I
Sure.
want to pursue this with you because this is relatively new material to most of our listeners, and it needs to be given a forum. We'll do that with my guest tonight, Jim Keith, in just a couple of minutes.
You're listening to Sightings on the Radio.
Okay, we're talking with Jim Keith about many things. We're just beginning to talk about cattle mutilations now. In Michael Lindemann's CNI News, there is a story this week, a rather unusual one when it comes to reading about cattle mutilations. It is dealing with a bull mutilation in New Mexico. And apparently the reports were taken from Robert Bigelow's National Institute for Discovery Science, and it is unique, Jim Keith, in that it does talk about clearly what looks like a large craft landing in the area of the mutilation. You don't hear about that very often. In your studies, have you come across a number of reports of large, heavy objects maybe leaving gouge marks in the ground near the bodies of the cattle?
I don't know about that. I guess there have been reports of any number of things around these cattle mutilations, but primarily what you see are, number one, lights, which could be just about anything, and
Yes.
number two, black helicopters.
Some people say the black helicopters are actually coming along after the UFOs, that they're tracking them and following them.
I don't think that actually tends to wash, because oftentimes these black choppers are seen prior to the mutilations as well.
Uh-huh.
There are also a number of other clues that are basically completely hushed up. One of them being that the cattle are often marked with fluorescent paint.
Right. Well, Daryl Sims discovered that, and one of the people to discover it, and yes, we've talked about that on this program.
Okay. Also, in the area of mutilations in Colorado, back in the 70s, the district attorney there talked about something which is apparently fairly prevalent, which is these white cars with white trailers large enough to carry a chopper. And in fact, there are trailers used for launching choppers like that. They have a swing-out arm by which the chopper can be launched virtually in any locale.
Uh-huh.
Even more interesting than that to me is the fact that a lot of cattle have been infected with Clostridium bacteria. Now, Clostridium is an agent that the CIA has admitted to stockpiling. It is a biowarfare agent. And agents that have talked about the dealings of the CIA and so forth, specifically at Dugway Proving Ground, have admitted that the government has been involved in this covert biowarfare testing involving cattle, involving illegally stealing cattle and injecting them and so forth. And when they have been asked about this, what this was about and why, they have suggested that it is research involved in specifically anti-ethnic biowarfare, specifically aimed at the Oriental and at the black, because the membrane in the eye of the cow resembles the membrane of the eye in those two ethnic groups.
Really?
This is extraordinarily horrible, and I don't know why the country is not up in arms about this, but very credible witnesses have indicated that that's the case. Anti-ethnic virus.
Well, you talk about credible witnesses. I don't want names, but give me the type of person that is giving this information to you.
Well, I can give you names even. G.C. Ariane, former intelligence agent who spoke with an investigator in Salt Lake City, Utah, where Dugway Proving Ground was also two unnamed members or scientists working at Dugway. When you dig into the background of intelligence agency biowarfare testing, this stuff becomes very, very credible because, in fact, the CIA admits to at least 300 incidents of open-air testing of biowarfare agents in the United States since 1950, but people who are in the know about this say that it's over 1,000 instances where people, for instance, have been infected with viruses on purpose.
Well, sure, some of them have died, too.
Right.
And what we're talking about here is 25 years ago, you can talk about the creation of HIV. There's one of the earlies.
Right, and people say, this sort of thing is impossible. The government could never do this.
Well, they call it conspiracy, paranoia, and so forth. But all you've got to do is do the research. If you've heard Dr. Leonard Horowitz talk, Leonard has not only documented the creation of HIV via his production and reproduction of the documents, the contracts that were all let to Lytton Bionetics. I mean, he traces the whole thing. So, I mean, there's no paper trail. It's real documents.
When you dig into the background on this material, by reading books on biowarfare, you'll see that the government is capable of anything.
There is no more science fiction, and there are no limits. That's about the bottom line. When you talk about cattle mutilation like this and put that particular spin on it, that it is a biowar procedure, that these animals are being used at random, certainly the samples taken from them are chronically the same. They're being obviously analyzed. It would make more sense, what you're saying, than in some ways for an alien explanation. I mean, why would the aliens take the lips, some of the reproductive organs, and coring the rectum so often? This is very interesting, and it would be certainly an area where these toxins might concentrate.
Right.
That's easy.
Exactly. And in fact, when you dig into the documentation on this, for instance, I did a Freedom of Information request on the FBI on cattle mutilations and got back a couple of hundred pages, and you find that there are virtually no accounts of flying saucers, but there are many, many accounts of these white cars and white trailers and people being involved with the mutilations and black choppers. It gives one reason to speculate about why all we hear about in the media are aliens.
Now, on the other side of the coin, there are certainly an abundance of reports, though, Jim, of people who claim to see lights in the area, which they describe as UFO lights, not helicopter lights. But as we both know, helicopter technology has come a long way, and that can be part of it, too. We'll be right back with Jim Keith here at Sightings on the Radio.
You're listening to Sightings on the Radio.
Jim, the story you're laying out about cattle mutilations is remarkable. We're going to pursue this after the news as well. Lots to talk about. Briefly, you've laid out the fluorescent paint, which Daryl Sims really picked up. Apparently, cattle in slaughterhouses and cattle yards will show this fluorescence. The nicotine in the bloodstream, this particular type of bacteria. The anti-ethnic biowarfare research that may be going on, in other words, the membrane from the eyes, the sex organs, the rectal tissues, and so forth, might well be repositories of the residuals of these biowar elements that these cattle are being given. Why don't people like Linda Moulton Howe talk about some of these things?
That is a darn good question. It may be that they assume, as ArtBell mentioned to one of his guests prior to going on the air, that people aren't interested in conspiracies. Apparently, it may be that they think that people grasp the idea of aliens a lot more easily and with a lot more fervor than they grasp the idea of the government working behind the scenes and engaged in criminal acts. That would be one of my guesses.
Could it be that the government, if indeed what you're suggesting is going on, and it may, could it be that the government is dropping these cattle specifically knowing they're going to be found in order to facilitate and underwrite the myth of alien intervention and intrusion here, to keep that misdirection going, to keep people looking the other way?
It's quite possible. With the Men in Black, I see the government counterfeiting paranormal instances because, quite frankly, they know that people who are into UFOs, if they see a man in black at their doorstep, that they will have their wits scared out of them, and so that their attempts to keep these people quiet about UFO encounters will be very, very much more effective. Seeing a Man in Black would terrify something like that. And in addition to that, there are other instances where apparently there have been real paranormal activities that the government then gloms onto and utilizes that for its own purpose. For instance, there's a famous group of encounters called the Mothman encounters that took place in West Virginia starting in 1966.
Yeah, John Keel wrote about that, and we need to talk about that after the news,
Okay.
Jim. We're coming up here on the top of the hour. I want to mention, before we run out of time here, the book by Jim Keith, the new one, Casebook on the Men in Black, 224 pages, only $14.95, 5.5 by 8.5, big paperback book, and you can order it from Illuminate Press by simply calling 1-800-680-4638. That's 1-800-680-4638. And they'll take credit card orders and the works. That's a toll-free number. So Jim's book available there, and a lot of good books. Are all your books handled through Illuminate, Jim?
They don't publish all of my books, but they list all of my books in their catalog.
Tell us about another angle or two with respect to the cattle mutilations, the laser-like cuts that people are seemingly so perplexed over and convinced that they could only be done by alien technology. Do we have technology that can do that, in your opinion?
Just off the top of my head, I don't recall any specific mention of laser technology used by the government. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, because the government usually runs about 10 years ahead or more. Technically, in terms of what they're doing as to what they announce.
Yeah. All right.
Lasers, frankly, are not an alien technology.
No, in fact, they have a new laser now they can use in the dentist's office. Instead of drilling and grinding on cavities, they can use a laser, and it's painless. That'll be new, coming to your dentist fairly soon. We'll be back after news with hour number 2 of Sightings on the Radio with Jim Keith. Stay right there.
Enter the world of the paranormal.
UFOs,
Alien abductions,
ghosts,
out-of-body experiences,
past lives,
distant viewing,
government cover-ups.
Welcome to Sightings on the Radio. No mystery is closed to an open mind. Sightings on the Radio with your host, Jeff Rense.
And welcome back to hour number 2, everyone. My guest tonight, Jim Keith, who has over 10 books in print, all worth reading, all very interesting. Casebook on the Men in Black, his most recent title, now available through Illuminate Press on the internet. It is only $14.95, 224 pages, and you can get the book by ordering right from Illuminate Press, 24 hours a day, 1-800-680-4638. Jim, have you put a paper together postulating or proposing an earthly explanation for cattle mutilations, detailing all the evidence that you've laid out here in our show tonight?
Well, I tell you what, perhaps my most popular book is one called Black Helicopters Over America.
Oh, yeah.
I'm currently writing a sequel to that, and in that sequel, I detail all of this information that I've brought out tonight.
It's I think it's very important material, and I would call on anyone researching this field of cattle mutilations to consider it and certainly present it as part of the possible explanation.
Sure, and it may only be part of the explanation, but
of the explanation, right?
But it is a part that that we apparently understand, and so that information should come out. It may be that we are also seeing with these government ploys a counterfeiting of actual paranormal activities. Now, I don't know of even one cattle mutilation where we see gray aliens running about in the fields and doing their dirty work on cattle, but it may be. There may be a paranormal aspect to the mutilations, and then the government says this would make a great springboard for actually doing some of our own experimentation.
Well, it's what I suggested earlier, that the government is laying this off on the ETs and just carrying on having a grand old time.
And, there are a number of other aspects to UFO research that suggest the same thing. We see the UFO implants, I should say, employing a technology that is extremely similar to what the intelligence agencies have been involved with since the 1950s.
Yes.
Dr. Jose Delgado, who wrote a book called Physical Control of the Mind, invented something called the stimoceiver, which is the same thing. It's an implant that is injected into the head, which relays electronic impulses into the brain to control the person in various ways. And again, this isn't science fiction. You can pick up a copy of Physical Control of the Brain in a used bookstore. Physical Control of the Mind, excuse me.
And that's minimum 30-year-old technology. What they can do now must be really amazing.
Right. Something else that piqued my interest was a report that came out a few years ago regarding crop circles. Mm-hmm. Crop circles are an extremely strange phenomenon, but a young man who was hang gliding in an area where a lot of crop circles take place, which also, by the way, happens to be around Air Force bases in England, right. Saw a huge mylar construction, a huge reflective construction that was invisible until he got right up on it, because the mylar reflected the sky around it. And this mylar construction was right in the area where crop circles had been taking place. Now, it may be that we're looking at something on the order of Star Wars style SDI laser weaponry being tested in the English countryside, and we see these fantastically complex geometrics and so forth being done to throw people off, to have them associated with occultism or with UFOs. That's another possible area of research.
Yeah. Problems with that are that these formations have been reported long ago, before Star Wars technology was around, albeit not as sophisticated. What you're proposing is very possible. I think the technology is there for it. The number of these formations is huge, no question about that. We also have the problem of the luminosities.
The luminosities, which would be the...
Those are the round balls, globes of light that are seen so often flitting around the tops of the crops in the fields of England in the daylight and the night. There is a number of videotapings of them. They're considered to be fairly common. Okay. We do have the video, remember, last year of the Oliver's Castle formation, where the luminosities were shown in the video.
Right. Well, of course, crop circles have been reported again back to the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. And back in the old days, they showed little devils with scythes doing these things. So again, we may be seeing the counterfeiting of the paranormal.
I like that expression.
Mm-hmm.
The government counterfeiting the paranormal to carry on its black budget work. Very interesting.
Right.
Yeah, it's too bad that this doesn't make more of an appearance, what you're suggesting, because it would lend an air of credibility and believability to a lot of this. It might bring it into focus for even more profound and realistic scientific evaluation.
Right. Well, a lot of UFO research is strictly anecdotal. It's just people who believed they saw something or felt they saw something. Very little research is done into the background of these people, or whether they're selling, T-shirts with a slogan about it at the local UFO convention. Mm-hmm. But most of what I'm talking about is verified by credible witnesses, and I'm attempting to do that. For instance, I try to list all my sources in my books.
Well, this is a very interesting angle that we don't hear about. Certainly, when you consider the totality of UFOs, sightings, interactions, abductions, and so forth, it is vast. And if, in fact, the government were actually involved with abducting humans, there would have to be probably 10, 20, 30,000 full-time government agents at it because of the number of people reporting these events.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. There is such a thing as the propagation of urban legendary, and then people have a nightmare, and it takes on the form of the nightmares that they have heard about. Like I said, gray aliens are very little seen until about 1950. Up until then, you usually see the blonde Aryan contactees. But when the movies came out in the 1950s, like Invaders from Mars and so on, then you see the shape of these incidents taking on that characteristic. Then you see all kinds of big-eyed gray aliens. By the same token, I don't know if there's even one incident of alien abduction of the sort that we hear of today, being taken into a craft, being examined, perhaps being implanted or whatever, prior to the Betty and Barney Hill incident, which took place in the late 1960s. And so the content of earlier stories, earlier abductions, often shapes this delusory factor in UFOs. Again, I'm not saying that all UFO contactees are delusory by any means. And in fact, I think that many real contacts kind of walk the border of paranormal and are anomalous events that are defined partially by the person's mind. I'm not saying it's hallucination. I'm saying that it is a paranormal event that people have a hard time wrapping their wits around.
Would you suggest that there are people being abducted by aliens on this planet, or is it something that you feel might all be explained by terrestrial mechanisms?
I don't know. I really don't know. As I said, I had a contact apparently with a gray alien myself in 1972. I woke up in the middle of the night with one of these characters staring me right in the face, and there were certain details to the experience which were later confirmed by accounts by other abductees. Otherwise, I would have thought it was just a hypnagogic dream where I was confusing.
You have no doubt you were visited.
Yes, I do have some doubt that I was visited. I'm not sure that I know all of the characteristics of visitation on this planet. I think that we live in a form of reality that science has tried to nail down with a bit more vigor than they're capable of backing up. Things like the Men in Black, gray aliens, Bigfoot, ghosts, and so forth do unexplainable acts. They cross the border between reality and the paranormal. And I think that reality itself is a tad bit wilder than most people are willing to admit. Was I contacted? Was it a dream? It's a maybe.
We have had people on this program, you've heard them talk, who have told remarkable stories about abductions in great detail after undergoing hypnotherapy and regression and so forth. There are said to be, Bud Hopkins says that he used to think it was a relatively small number. Now he thinks it's many, many people are undergoing some kind of an experience. Going back to your earlier point about implants, though, I have some material on the website under Secret Weapons, and all of you are certainly invited to go visit the website. It's simply www.sightings.com. We've got stories on there about implants. You can see x-rays of these things that have been put in people's heads, and they certainly look like, in this case, terrestrial technology. But it's a big subject, and we'll be back with Jim Keith in just a couple of minutes here at Sightings on the radio.
You're listening to Sightings on the Radio.
And we are back talking with Jim Keith. Anything else to add to that, Jim?
That's a good question, Jeff. What were we talking about?
Oh, about 15 different things. What I want to do, though, is before I forget to get into this, is we should probably dive into the Mothman thing. You talked a little bit about that. John Keel written a very interesting book called The Mothman Prophecies.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary book. It's easily one of the most entertaining UFO books ever written, but in addition to that, it chronicles one of the most extraordinary complexes of paranormal encounters that I know of, which took place in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, starting in 1966 and going on for about a year.
Yeah, Point Horror, West Virginia.
Right. Right, there were any number of things that took place there. Lots of UFOs, these strange flying creatures that they dubbed Mothmen. There were MIBs all over the place using flash guns and telephone harassment. And again, as I say about a number of things, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that maybe paranormal occurrences did take place that started off on these Mothman encounters.
Yes.
But there's also a great deal of evidence to suggest that there was a human factor there as well. Like I said, the Men in Black were very much in evidence using CIA technology like the flash gun, which they would fire in people's eyes and they would be blinded for a minute or whatever. Yeah. A lot of telephone harassment, breather calls, weird electronic sounds. This hooks into John Keel's background as well. Keel, although he doesn't really tout the fact very much, was in psychological operations in the military and was responsible for a radio show by Radio America, Radio Free America, whatever it's termed, a dramatization of Frankenstein, which had much the same effect as the earlier Orson Welles dramatization of War of the Worlds. Thousands of people called in, horrified, believing that what was being done on the show was in actuality taking place. Gray Barker was also evident there at that same time, and as I said, Gray Barker admitted to hoaxing and was involved in a wide variety of hoaxing. As far as why military intelligence would be involved in that, UFO buffs could learn a lot by studying straight ahead the history of mind control in America. You find that a lot of people who are into UFOs have not studied the activities of the CIA and other intelligence agencies through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, involved with drugs, involved with counterfeiting of these weird effects, involved with implants. This stuff has been rather scrupulously documented by a lot of authors, and people who are into studying UFOs ought to cross over fields and look at some of this conspiracy material, because I believe that in many cases it does cast insight upon UFO encounters.
I agree, and certainly there's no investigator I know of who could not benefit from even more perspective, and that would be it. We've done programs with, I've had recently Walter Board on here, who wrote the book Operation Mind Control, really a brilliant essay of the whole thing. There are a number of books out there about it now. It is obviously surrounded with a lot of solid evidence, a tremendous amount of research, and it's rather disgusting when you take it at face value and look at what's been going on here.
Well, I don't know how much disgust I should portray. When earlier on we were talking about the creation of specifically anti-ethnic viruses,
that's disgusting.
I think my disgust quotient is filled up to the brim.
Yep. Well, I hear you. I understand, and there are probably not many listening who would disagree with that. There are many other things about this Mothman incident that I'd like to touch on just briefly. As I recall, it had a penchant for blood.
That's a good question. A penchant for blood. Tell me more.
Well, there was one story about how a lot of blood was removed from a blood bank, taken out, in whatever pints, and disappeared. Ambulances.
Now that you mention it, yeah. Apparently it did have a penchant for blood. I'm thinking of an incident where guys driving a truck that was going to the local blood bank were chased by this Mothman, and
that's right.
That's pretty wild. Maybe the old timers back in the Middle Ages were on to more than we admit when they told these tales about demons and vampires.
A lot of people would suggest that the demons and vampires were our alien visitors again.
It could easily be, but on the other hand, there's a fine point there. What is there to suggest that maybe these are localized aliens from Earth? Because we really don't have any indication that these guys come from outer space, as is usually assumed.
Well, you know what Bob Dean says when he's asked that question, something similar. Do they come from the past? Do they come from another dimension? Are they from our time, or are they from the future? And Bob simply says, all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he came across in the assessment that he says he had daily access to in the 1960s when he worked at the top levels of NATO in Europe.
I don't know. I cast a somewhat jaded eye upon all of these military men outing themselves and
It's an
coming
interesting way to put it.
coming out of the Twilight Zone closet, with their accounts of what took place at the highest levels of the secret government. Although I'm not familiar with Mr. Dean, I find that a lot of those accounts, for instance, the stories of Bill Cooper, are rather incredible and often are documentably made up on the spot.
Well, I think, yes, most people who really do spend any time with us would probably concur with that. Who in the UFO field, in your opinion, commands your highest respect?
Oh, very simply, Jacques Vallée has done some wonderful work. I very much like John Keel as well. I think he really blew off all of the trappings about these are men from outer space, and opened up the realization that the creatures that have been called fairies, demons, and trolls from ancient history may be the same personnel. Those are two guys whose work I enjoy very much. Although it isn't really an answer to your question, I just remembered something else. Speaking about implants, Whitley Strieber mentioned at a MUFON conference a couple of years ago that he had been implanted with a couple of implants, and while it's not often mentioned in the media, he wondered if in fact he wasn't being controlled by intelligence agencies. He mentioned that as a child he had been given a battery of very curious intelligence tests by who he knew not, and he wondered if maybe that these implants were not quite as extraterrestrial as people often believe.
I had some odd tests too as a child. I don't know. I had dinner with Whitley about 3 weeks ago, and he's a very interesting man, very complicated. What we have are implants, as you know, which have been successfully surgically removed from now 6 individuals who all have abduction backgrounds by Dr. Roger Lear, working with Daryl Sims and other surgeons. There are other candidates now in the offing. In 2 different people, the exact same implant was located and removed, the same configuration, the same type. This is all documented on videotape, of course, and these implants are under continuing analysis. So there is something going on. One of the individuals had a history of having the implants in him for over, I believe it was 35 years, a long, long period of time. And that's the whole field that needs much more research.
Yeah, actually, there is an activist group in Sweden called Mediaco, which is all about people who believe they have been implanted. Many of them have been confirmed by X-ray, and also people who believe that they've been irradiated by extremely low frequency.
Yep, a lot of that too. We have to pause, Jim. Hold on, programs. If you would.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll be right back. Thank you. And Jim Keith, my guest, the program Sightings on the Radio, and we shall return.
You're listening to Sightings on the Radio.
And we are back. Jim Keith, guest tonight, his new book called Casebook on the Men in Black, available through Illuminate Press. And we'll give you the phone number one more time before the program ends. The book itself, Jim, comes to what conclusions? Do you draw any real severe, stringent conclusions on this, or is it pretty much left open?
What I say is that you're not really going to understand the Men in Black so long as you pigeonhole them into one category. But the best way for understanding it is as a kind of evolving phenomenon that has several different aspects. And I isolate at least 4 different sources of the MIB phenomenon, and those I isolate are government. I say that the government has been involved in the harassing of UFO witnesses since the 1950s.
Yes.
I also talk about hoaxers who kind of muddy the Men in Black waters, including a few of the more well-known members of the UFO community. I also mention delusion, and this is certainly a touchy topic for a lot of people who are dyed-in-the-wool UFO researchers or UFO buffs, but in fact, if you research the UFO community itself and talk to UFO people, you'll find that a lot of them do tend to be somewhat paranoid and guilty of misperception. Not all of them, but there is that element. In addition to that, I say that my research suggests there are a supernatural Men in Black that is unexplainable in terms of straight materialism or things that we know. These Men in Black have been around throughout the ages, but they've been unchanged for most part since the early times. Back in the olden days, they called them fairies and trolls and demons, but now they tend to be the UFO silencers or the CIA.
Right.
In order to understand the history and the nature of the Men in Black, you have to take in account at least those 4 different aspects, and then you will see that it's not just guys from Arcturus, but it is a rather complex issue that by dissecting it becomes a little less complex.
Has anyone ever claimed to have been involved with the Men in Black and tried to come forward with the truth of at least part of what you just laid out for us?
Well, William Moore specified the particular agency of the government that the Men in Black come from, according to him. I list the name of the agency in the book. It's a jumble of numbers. I don't really recollect what it is, but one wonders about William Moore, because of course he is government connected.
Still.
Well, at least he was at one time. And also, not that it's been heard anyplace else, but Charles Berlitz, who was the collaborator on 2 of his most famous books, on the Philadelphia Experiment and upon Roswell, was former OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. That also has never been heard before your show.
In your opinion, the Philadelphia Experiment, as proffered by Berlitz and Moore, just straight fiction?
I'm not an expert on the Philadelphia Experiment, but what I have read suggests that it is fiction. But like I said, I'm not an expert on that.
It's amazing how these things, if they are fiction, are spawned, born, released into the public, take on a life of their own, continue to grow and evolve. Look at the Montauk Project books. I think there are 4 of them now.
I was just going to mention Montauk. Again, we've got an evolving reality here. We get a movie about the Philadelphia Experiment and the Philadelphia Experiment book, and then it is totally validated by these Montauk books, which, again, I consider to be fiction. We have a similar kind of a thing going on, I think, with this woman who claims to have been a CIA mind control slave in the Monarch program.
Kathy O'Brien.
Yeah, Kathy O'Brien. Her book is called Transformation
of America.
A Transformation of America. And again, I could be wrong, but the book, I find it extremely suspect. I don't find that it is backed up by much solid evidence. Of course, people, true believers, are horrified by me saying things like that, and oftentimes, people will never speak to me again after chatting with me about UFOs. But that's just my call, and I'm just being honest.
Jim, it's very interesting to mention that book, because that book has really tipped some people over one way or the other. It doesn't leave many people straddling the fence, and I've met some very bright people that I have a lot of respect for who have and I have not passed judgment on the book, I haven't read it, but they have bought into that lock, stock, and barrel, totally, to the extent that they begin to proselytize about it and pick up the banner. It's, in a way, it's kind of scary, because I'm sure there's some truth to the book, but as you say, there are people who've read it that I know that call into question a great many parts of it, excessive, fantastical, and so on and so forth.
Right. Well, that is the nature of disinformation. It really only plays if it is anchored in truth. And, of course, Kathy O'Brien talking about CIA mind control programs is anchored in truth. But I think, judging from her accounts, I think she's either prevaricating or else is having some hypnotic sessions that get into fantasy.
Couldn't it be that she might be actually being run as well?
Oh, there is that possibility. Although I didn't really detect anything in the book that suggested that. It's pretty wide open. But like I said, primarily I just don't find any corroboration for her version of what happened to her.
Yeah, it's a real interesting book in that the impact it has on people is invariably, as I said, profound, one way or the other. There are another number of men in black in your book that are called Unreal Men in Black.
Right.
What's that all about?
Well, just as a thumbnail, the word reality is kind of a semantic absurdity. I mean, it really doesn't have a definition. You look up you look up reality in the dictionary, and it says what's real or true or factual. Then you look up real and true and factual, and you say, and it will say what is reality. In fact, it is kind of a Mobius strip that gets nowhere. I'm not sure that that reality it really is all that it's cracked up to be, because these men in black cases sometimes seem to violate many of the conditions that we think of as being reality.
Give me an example or two.
Yeah, and it points up the possibility that maybe reality itself is a convenient fiction that people have come up with to assure themselves that the deck is going to be underneath them in the next moment.
A lot of people would agree with that.
Yeah.
How about a couple of examples of these stretch situations?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm thinking of right now is my own belief about the MIBs, the Men in Black, about UFOs, about many of these things. I'm seeing them as being a kind of externalization of interior phenomena. You see people witnessing a UFO experiencing a traumatic event, and I speculate that they may be externalizing a portion of what they're experiencing in the environment. It's been noted in the human organism, when it is threatened, when it comes close to death, that it tends to create these realities that it believes in. For instance, when people have alcohol poisoning, they often see pink elephants or they often see lizards. I think it is also true of many of these paranormal effects that they're shaped by mental or spiritual conditions. For instance, in people that dramatize the wounds of Jesus upon their body, you might speculate that they are externalizing energies that they have a hard time dealing with. A lot of these people are celibate, and believe me, there's a lot of energy connected with sex.
Well, that gets into poltergeists and teenage girls and so forth. We'll be right back with Jim Keith in just a minute. Thank you, Jim. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Sightings on the Radio.
You know, Jim, I did mention just before we went off the air, and I was covering your comments, but thank you for that. It is true that poltergeists apparently involve the manifestation of a tremendous amount of pent-up sexual, certainly physical energy, and often from young girls. And that's a very interesting thing to consider, that the mind can manifest actually objects moving, things changing on the physical realm as we see it.
Exactly. That's what I'm suggesting as a possible solution for some of these contacts. I remember a very interesting account of a woman named Billy Tipton, who masqueraded as a man her entire life and became a famous jazz musician. When she died in the early 1990s, they found out she was a woman. Now, a woman doing that, masquerading as a man, would apparently have a lot of pent-up psychological situations.
Right.
But one thing that is noted is that Billy Tipton's house was repeatedly showered with anomalous falls of rocks during her lifetime.
Rocks?
Yeah, rocks.
What kind of rocks?
Of no explanation. Just big rocks would pelt her roof constantly during her lifetime. Again, I'm saying that her psychological case of conflict may have externalized itself in the real universe, so-called.
Sure, big load to carry. Could have been.
Yeah.
Could have been. Very interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't know that at all. Bufo Calvin is on this program. He does a lot of Fortean work and talks to us about things falling from the sky and so forth, fish falls and all sorts of weird things. And
Jeff,
that's interesting.
Jeff, while we're red tabbing weird things, there's something about abductions that people don't hear very much about, and that is that a lot of abductees say that these things didn't take place in flying saucers, but took place in houses and hotels. As one example of that, I interviewed a woman a few years back who had visited with the high priest of the Satanic Church in San Francisco. She maintained she was drugged and taken to a hotel where she was worked upon and implanted by humans.
Huh. Do you hear singing?
Yes, I do.
Wonder where that's coming from. Trying to identify that. Almost sounds like a Disney
That's what
film.
I was going to say. It sounds like
Snow White.
White.
I think it is Snow White.
It was the Satanic connection that brought that in, I think.
Well, it's all this.
Monarch.
I have a lot of repressed energy, and it must be manifesting itself in Snow White. How interesting. A paranormal occurrence here at Sightings on the radio. This is very interesting. I also have had conversations recently, Jim, with abductees who are now reporting, I guess more and more of them are saying they see military figures or people in uniform during these experiences, many of which happen apparently on board a craft, and some of them, as you said, are now being reported as having occurred in rather earthly dwellings, i.e. laboratories and so forth.
I chatted with a gentleman who had missing time in New Mexico a few years back. He had about an hour and a half of missing time while he was traveling through the mountains in New Mexico. And as he came out of the missing time and drove into town, he was extraordinarily confused about what he saw, because a government vehicle, big Lincoln-style vehicle with government plates, drove out on the highway ahead of him with what appeared to be a mock-up of a UFO on a trailer, a mock-up of a flying saucer strapped on a trailer behind it. This took place immediately after his incident of missing time.
You mean they hadn't even bothered to cover it up?
Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it had nothing to do with it. But I find it interesting.
Oh, indeed. This is fun talking with you. How about another anomalous thing we can throw into the mix here that we're red tagging?
Okay. A woman who believed she had been abducted stated that it was not to a UFO, but rather to a house in Los Angeles. The researcher who looked into it was able to verify the woman's knowledge of the inside of the house by a previous occupant. When the researcher inquired as to the current person who was renting the place, it turned out to be a doctor who had been involved in CIA mind control experiments during the infamous MK Ultra period during the 1950s and 60s. And there's another example, perhaps, of counterfeiting of paranormality. All you have to do is have a person who has been experimented upon mention aliens or UFOs, and immediately they are not credible to the media, they're not credible to anybody.
Well, that's what I said early on, that there is a case being made by more and more people now that the entire alien issue, the alien scenario, is being used and has been co-opted by various intelligence agencies to obscure, cloud, and otherwise hide their dirty work.
honestly, I don't think there's any question about it. Really, where the open-ended factor is are there alien encounters otherwise, and that is really quite an unexplainable area that we haven't gotten to the bottom of, but I believe that the whole CIA intelligence agency connection has been verified.
How about the issue of possible collusion with off-planet or on-planet intelligence that is not human necessarily?
Well, you know what I have found, that the majority of things that people cite as proof in terms of that hypothesis, that the government and the aliens are working together.
Well, there is no proof.
Right. There is no proof, and what people sometimes cite as proof tends to be apparently disinformational or just plain bogus.
Right.
So I'm one of these bad guys who really tends to haul out Occam's razor and say if there's no corroboration, then in all probability it isn't true.
Indeed. All right, we're going to take our last break here, Jim Keith, and come right back with more at Sightings on the Radio.
You're listening to Sightings on the Radio.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Our remaining few minutes with Jim Keith. His new book, Casebook on the Men in Black. Jim Keith, Keith, $14.95 over 224 pages, 5.5 by 8.5 quality paperback. And to order the book, you can call Illuminate Press at 1-800-680-4638 or 1-800-680-INET, I-N-E-T. And they have a nice website, www.illuminate.com, and check it out. They have some really terrific books. John Keel, one of the other authors that they have, certainly they have a lot of Jim Keith's books. They're all listed there. Jim, what's next for you?
I'm working on a book on mind control, believe it or not.
Now, that's something that really needs to be controlled and assayed and put down in book form that stays away from the hype and the paranoia.
You know, I'm going to try and call it honestly and see where the research takes me. But in fact, there hasn't really been a full-scale research job done on mind control since the book you mentioned earlier, Boart's Operation Mind Control, that came out in the 60s.
Correct. Yeah, he's upgraded it somewhat, and he's an interesting guy. Boy, there's some bright ones out there. How about the black helicopters over America? Tell me about that book briefly and how it's done since it was released, I guess, about a year and a half ago.
Well, you know, the black helicopters, in a way, are kind of a parallel to the Men in Black.
They are.
In that these unmarked black helicopters have been harassing people, have been shooting at people, have been spraying them with unknown chemicals since the 1960s. The military these days says, no, there's no black helicopters. It's all this deep olive drab that looks black from a distance. But in fact, the military has only brought out that olive drab paint job in the 1990s. So there is a solid, very strange black helicopter phenomenon, and it's pretty scary.
Can you take a guess at what the heck is going on with those things? I mean, really, what's the point? What's the purpose? Why?
There's a number of answers to that, but I'll give you one of the most recent. There were many black helicopter flights over Oakville, Washington in 1994, and there were 6 rains of a weird gelatinous substance that made everybody in town sick. And so here again, we're keying right into the cattle mutilation and the testing of biowarfare. There are a lot of cross currents between all of these phenomena, and most of them relate back to the government. But like I said, I'm not a guy who completely discounts the paranormal. There's that aspect in many of these areas of research as well.
Jim, with so many of these helicopters operating for so long, why haven't we had someone come forward who allegedly was operating one and involved in this? I don't recall having heard that from anybody yet. Maybe I've missed it.
Well, in fact, we have. I have at least 2 interviews with black helicopter pilots in my upcoming sequel about the black helicopters. I also met with a man who crawled all over a black helicopter that was in a hangar at a local Air Force base and gave me pretty detailed specifics on it, and it wasn't olive drab.
Really?
Yeah.
All right, Jim Keith, that's the end of the program. It went very fast. I want to thank you for visiting with me tonight. It was very enjoyable, very informative, and would you come back?
I'd love to, Jeff.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. And once again, Jim Keith's new book is Casebook, The Men in Black, and it's an extraordinary book from Illuminat Press, and you can order it once again by calling 1-800-680-4638. Thank you, Jim. Take care. We'll talk.
You do the same, Jeff.
Okay. And thanks to all of you for being with me tonight again at Sightings on the Radio. Tomorrow night means Jeff gets a night off, but I'll be back Sunday night, 8 to 11 Pacific Time, 3 hours. A great show for you then. Hope you can be with us. Until then, have yourselves a great night, and good luck. Invaders from Mars, or it came from outer space, and any kid with an imagination is off to the races.
Yeah, not just kids either. You know, there's something to be said for those early UFO, or those early science fiction movies, in a way shaping the content of people's abduction scenarios and what they experienced. For instance, those big-headed aliens are really not much in evidence prior to the 1950s when they appeared in the movies. Not to say that UFO contact isn't real, but I think that it has a paranormal aspect that is also shaped by our minds.
I agree. You know, speaking of that film, and I guess it's available in video stores, Invaders from Mars, the little kid looking through the telescope, watching people fall through the sand and into the underground chambers. That movie has always raised issues in my mind. Did the people somehow writing that film have information or contacts which fed them information? Because we're talking about a film, 1953, that has abductions, implants, a drone race serving a highly evolved being, which has a rather large head and not much of a torso, and I believe just a few long tentacles or something. It was a very interesting film, and I found it to be rather suspiciously well informed in retrospect.
Yeah, remarkably so, because usually contactees back in those days were more often visited by these sort of tall, Aryan, blonde-haired characters rather than big-headed aliens. It was a kind of a full-blown prediction of the experiences people would start to have, really starting about the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then the other one I really liked was, I think it was Richard Denning. It Came from Outer Space. Remember that one?
Indeed, I do. One of my other favorites.
Interpretation of how they appeared.
Well, in olden times, they were thought to be agents of the devil. And they would be seen at witches' sabbats, and they would be contacting people and having them sell their soul. And people would ride to these witches' conclaves on pigs, and there would be a man in black officiating at some kind of a sacrificial ceremony, or so forth. But really, starting about the 1900s, more often you see the men in black seen in a technological context, usually seen in conjunction with a witness who has seen a UFO, and the men in black will show up at their doorstep, often in groups of 3, and warn them not to say a thing about it. Kind
of like Jehovah's Witnesses.
Indeed.
No kidding. Just door to door, and this is we have historical precedent going back to the beginning of this century that was going on.
Right. Well, actually, the door-to-door kind of thing, warning against the supernatural or the occult or the UFO thing, didn't take place back in the Middle Ages. Like I said, it was mostly they were thought to be agents of the devil.
I see.
But in the 20th century, apparently the devil is not quite so believable of a figure, and so these men in black are usually trying to hush people up about their occurrences with UFOs.
Oh, interesting. Have you run across very many people in your research who claim to have had direct encounters with these men?
I've run across a number. I've collected literally hundreds of examples of this, and I must say it is truly a strange phenomenon. When I first went into studying the issue of the men in black, I was extraordinarily skeptical about about it, and particularly as having been a monster and science fiction fan as a child.
Well, that's wonderful. I'd rather do that than sit down and watch MTV for 40 hours a week.
I guess so.
So it came from outer space, the craft that looked like a meteorite. It really wasn't. It was a ship. It landed in the desert. It was in trouble, and the beings on board wanted simply time to repair it and get the heck out of here. It reminds me of the October 13th meteorite overflight over Los Angeles, which has been termed by a number of people as actually a spacecraft that landed in Northridge in the hills there at Rocketdyne, was repaired and took off. We're going to do a program about that again quite soon. But again, a very prescient kind of plot.
Yeah, and it's not completely out of the question that the movie makers at that time might have been contacted by people who had a vested interest in this, because in FBI memos, CIA memos back at that time, they pretty well assumed that they could influence the media. One example of that taking place somewhat later is President Nixon deciding that the movies and the TV should portray all of these crime-fighting motifs, at which point all of them started to do that with the Untouchables and so forth.
Exactly, and you really confirmed a suspicion I had. I don't want to lean too far in that direction, but it does seem pretty obvious that the possibility, it was certainly a very viable one, that some people in the film industry at that time were getting some information, because the plots were really advanced if you think about what we know now.
Sure, it could easily have been.
Men in Black. You talk in the book about how they've been really around for thousands of years. They certainly weren't wearing two-piece suits, 500 years ago. But when you talk about Men in Black, what's the old style and presents startling evidence about their origin and their purpose? So let's say hello now to my guest tonight, Jim Keith. Hello, Jim. Are you there?
Hi there, Jeff. Yes, I am.
I want to thank you for coming on the program. I've been trying to get you on this show for a long time, and it's overdue, so we're going to have fun tonight. Casebook on the Men in Black. How much research went into it? I imagine quite a bit, since you're talking about a phenomenon that apparently goes back a long time.
Well, I don't want to sound like a hoary old graybeard or anything, but I've been interested in the paranormal and in conspiracy since I was a kid, and I've been hearing about the Men in Black really since the 1950s, and so I guess you could say that I've been researching them all along. On the other hand, I did bust the books and get on the internet and contact everybody I knew over a period of 6 months to find out everything that I could just recently to write the book.
Tell me what, as a kid in the 50s, you heard about the Men in Black. I didn't hear about them.
Well, I was a big UFO big UFO buff, I should say.
Sure.
Back then, I bought hook, line, and sinker the writings of guys like George Adamski and Truman Bertram, who believed that or said that they had taken trips to other planets in UFOs.
Right.
And the Men in Black, were mentioned sporadically back then in connection with early UFO incidents, like, for instance, the Maury Island contact, the Albert Bender contact with Men in Black, and so I sort of heard about them out of my peripheral ear, mm-hmm. And I recall as a kid always, just kind of keeping my eyes open for neighbors who I thought might be aliens.
Well, there's a good imagination for you. All you had to do is go to the theater and see something like in.
Enter the world of the paranormal.
UFOs.
Alien abductions.
Ghosts.
Out-of-body experiences.
Past lives.
Distant viewing.
Government cover-ups.
Welcome to Sightings on the Radio. No mystery is closed to an open mind. Sightings on the Radio. With your host, Jeff Rense.
And hello once again, everybody. Of all the current writers researching the field of UFOs, ETs, secret weapons technology, and other enigmatic and occult areas, perhaps none is more controversial or respected than Jim Keith, who has, to date, authored over 10 of the most intriguing books now on the market. Jim's latest book represents another intriguing look at an unknown and highly controversial phenomenon. Its title is Casebook on the Men in Black, and it is published by Illuminate Press. Men in Black incidents straddle the realms of mysticism and science, occultism and UFOs, material reality and fantasy, partaking of all, defined by none. Since ancient times, these mysterious beings have stalked the planet, and in recent years they have tried to silence witnesses of UFO sightings with threats, harassment, and even worse. Who are these strange beings garbed all in black? Are they government agents, aliens, creatures from another dimension? Well, in Casebook on the Men in Black, author Jim Keese traces the path of these unusual visitors through history